everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Marian, and today I just wanted to talk about something that's been on my mind and kind of raise a question to those of you who might be thinking about this yourselves or have some experience in it. And the big question is studying literature worth it? And by studying here, I'm talking about in a more formal sense. So, whether that's doing a degree or doing some coursework, either at a university or online, is it worth it? Like, what can you get out of it? Um, are there any benefits? And what do you do if maybe the institution has a different outlook than you or a different interpretation of literature or particular works? So that's what I want to get into. We'll be returning to some long neglected scratch art here and making a little progress. And yeah, I just want to hear your thoughts as much as anything. And I'm just going to be sharing my own experiences with this, um, which are maybe a little bit different, a little bit unconventional. So we'll chat about that. And again, please feel free to add your own comments below, whether you agree or disagree. So my background is actually in STEM. So I did a STEM degree in university. I went to both a community college and a state university, did 2 years at each. And it was when I was studying my STEM degree that I actually discovered a real love of history. And of course, I already had a long-standing love of literature, but history was something that really became a huge part of my life during that time for different reasons. And I had a really wonderful professor who really helped instill that love in me. So that was something I realized about a year into my education. And, but I'd already kind of chosen my path, or rather, it's a bit of a long story. I'm not going to go into the STEM part of things in this video. What I just wanted to talk about was the fact that I spent my second year in university, and I spent the second year and about half of the, or a third of the following year studying history as electives. I didn't have an opportunity to do a history degree, not in the way that would have been easy. I could have done like a interdisciplinary degree at this campus and, you know, kind of worked my way into history from a different angle. But the long and short of it is I only had the opportunity to take courses. And so I took a bunch of courses and had several different teachers in the end and really, really, really got into it. But again, had not changed my original education path for a variety of reasons. Some of the topics I studied included Russian history, European history in the 19th century, British history in the 20th century, and a variety of history courses and political science courses from around the world. So, including South America, Africa, like quite a big sweep. I think the only countries I really didn't study in depth were East Asian countries, and probably didn't do as much in depth of South Asia either, but spent a lot of time in Europe, in Russia, in Latin America. So um, that was really, really valuable. And I learned so much that I'd never learned before, even though I'd had a pretty good education on the history side of things growing up. But it just really expanded my knowledge, my ideas about the world, about people, about things I should care about, um, and things that affected me in ways I had no previous way of knowing. So it was really important for personal development, but I wanted to also talk about how it was important for my professional development as well, because obviously I was going into a very different field, and you might think there's really no overlap. On the other hand, I also had this hobby at the time, and still do, of reviewing literature. So obviously there's a huge benefit in that area of my life, getting a lot more context for novels by Dostoevsky, for various American classics as well, and Of course, European literature kind of made a lot more sense to me after I learned about, the revolutions in the 1840s and so on. So that's kind of my biggest takeaway. I should say my first takeaway, not my biggest takeaway, is that if you do study literature or history, and I did one literature class or arts class that covered literature, but I also studied literature through some of the history courses as well. To be clear, um, it definitely helps you learn to read better. I think it really challenges you to get out of your comfort zone a bit because the books I was reading, many of them were old classics for sure, but they weren't necessarily titles I would have chosen or even known about on my own, especially when it came to some of the American literature. The list we were given was really a deep cut, if you will. It was very obscure, but wonderful, like really interesting titles, and some of them I still want to go back to and read at some point. Um, so that was great, getting out of my comfort zone from a literature perspective and um, sharing my views in an in-person class setting was different, obviously, because when you have your own blog or your YouTube channel or even an online forum, you don't really have to articulate yourself in quite the same way. Like, obviously, I do these videos, but it's really different when you're in a conversational in person setting that's also a bit structured and formal. And, you're being graded on some of it as well. So, um, it's a good challenge. It's a really good challenge. It's good to, hear other people's perspectives as well. So, that was really important. Um, the second reason I think this education was so valuable was I learned how to write better. Again, I had a pretty good uh, grammar English education growing up. I was homeschooled, so we we actually spent a lot of time on that, and it was really a big focus when I was younger. But I learned how to write good essays in university, actually at community college, if I'm being honest. Had a really good instructor and learned a way of writing, of organizing my thoughts that just made sense to me because up till then, it just didn't make sense how you would write a good essay. And he was able to give me a process that I could replicate and use over and over again. Really basic process, basically the 3 point paragraph system, if you've heard of that. And that worked so well for me. And I still, like, if I were to do any formal writing today, I would take a similar approach. So that was really useful. Obviously, when you have somebody grading your work, they can get very rigorous about it and they will point out, any little flaws or anything where you made a claim and didn't really back it up well. And they also teach you how to follow a manual of style, whether that's APA or Chicago. Chicago's my favorite. Different style guides. And it may seem like, a bit hampering if you have somebody nitpicking you, right? It may feel like, oh, in the real world, people kind of write, they break the rules, and, why do I need someone to nitpick me and grade me like that? And I think that that is a natural feeling you can have, but what I will say is that having someone to do that and someone who is an expert in it um, really raised my level of writing and just articulation in general. And so even today, if I'm breaking a rule, at least I have a better awareness of it and I can think about whether it makes sense to break that rule all the time or just sometimes to bring about a particular effect. So, that technical side of reading and writing, I would never have been able to achieve that if I hadn't taken some kind of course. And I did mention online courses earlier. I think distance learning is completely, uh, you know, valid as well. So, and some of these discussions, for example, are happening on Zoom calls and stuff if you're doing distance learning. So, I'm absolutely including that in this discussion. But either way, I think having an expert critique you and guide you is so helpful and so transferable. Um, So, the other thing I wanted to touch on here is, maybe you'll have a class where you don't agree with all the assignments or you have some issue with them. I remember in one of my courses having some issues with some of the assigned viewing, and obviously some of the perspectives I disagreed with, some of the things the teacher was teaching, right? And yet I did find it really, really helpful because what it does is it helps you solidify your own views. It helps you look at things critically, both your views and other people's views. And it also challenges you to maybe speak up sometimes or, have a private conversation with the instructor about, you know, maybe how you feel about something. Or there was one assignment in particular I decided to opt out of, and we talked about it. And I had kind of looked at the numbers on my grades and said, yes, I can opt out of this. It's not going to kill my grade, it'll be fine. And I was really clear about it to the instructor. And it wasn't easy by any means. I was quite nervous about it, but I think it was such a valuable experience. And the other thing that's really important about that is being able to operate in other people's contexts. So, if you only ever do book discussions or learning with people who agree with you, then you're missing out on an important part of learning, which is, that critical analysis, really having to confront other worldviews, maybe even learn something, maybe there's parts that you will find actually, your perspective changes, and that's okay too. So, it really depends on the class, I will say. And I would say if you're going into a new lecture series, if you feel like you're just not going to get on with the instructor at all, it's okay to, drop it and pick up a different one. Because some instructors are just very, they're very, maybe harder to work with than others, right? I was very fortunate to have some great instructors, even when we disagreed, and I think that's the difference, right? Can they encourage you, even if they're in a different context or a different worldview, whatever it may be? So finding the right people to learn with is really important, and you just have to kind of navigate that. But learning how to navigate that is also really, really helpful for the real world, right? Um, the third point I want to get to here is I learned some really good research mindsets in those courses, whether it was literature or history, but especially learning history. Um, you know, One thing you might assume is that somebody with a STEM degree is better at research than someone with a humanities degree, but nothing could be further from the truth. I've been on some projects, some work projects where the research just wasn't very good, or there was just this idea that we need to um, we need to validate our theories, and it was set up as a test, but there was just this real bias running throughout it, and sometimes the quality of the findings weren't super great. So one thing that I learned from my history courses is rather than going into something with preconceived ideas, go into it with a lot of curiosity. Try to find out what the research is telling us and not whether it proves my particular point. Um, and I remember one or two projects in particular, one or two papers that I was writing where the findings or the thesis that I came up with was not really what I had started out with. Like, it wasn't necessarily um, my assumption. I realized that the more I read, the more I researched, that things were pointing a different direction. And that was really, really helpful. Um, so, yeah, I think just to kind of break down some stereotypes, sometimes the humanities, it's not a hard and fast science by any means, but you can certainly learn some good practices from it. And you may not learn them as much in other fields. Um, so, again, it's very context dependent. I'm not saying this is always the case, but just trying to show how it can help, even if you're in a technical field. So, yeah, I think those were kind of my big reasons to study literature or history or, other humanities. But let me know what you think in the comments. Maybe you've done an entire literature degree, or maybe you've had some bad experiences and want to share those. I think from my personal, obviously anecdotal experience, it was so valuable, and I wish I had been able to do a full degree. But even if I haven't, I've learned so much from it, and it's really helped this channel as well become a better quality than otherwise I could have come up with on my own. So, yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I will see you next time. Bye.